Arrest for feeding homeless people in El Cajon, the police action getting national attention, and the dilemma for local churches. Detaining immigrants is big business in Otay Mesa, the for-profit facility gearing up for expansion as ICE holds more people. And one of the deadliest cities in the world is just a few miles away. The reasons behind Tijuana's skyrocketing homicide rate. I'm Ebony Monet, and the KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Ebony Monet, in for Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are Lindsay Winkley, public safety reporter for the San Diego Union Tribune, and Claire Tragesser, multimedia journalist for KPBS News. Also, Maya Srikrishnan, reporter for Voice of San Diego, and Sandra Dibble, who covers the border and Baja California for the San Diego Union Tribune. Let's begin with El Cajon. Feeding the hungry is not a crime. That was the message from Break the Ban, a homeless advocacy group that is now threatening to sue the city of El Cajon after El Cajon police arrested about a dozen group members for feeding the homeless in a public park. Lindsay, you covered the fallout after the arrest. Can you talk to me about how the police handled the arrest?
Yeah, I think that this wasn't an unexpected reaction from police. Break the Ban has said pretty much since the beginning that they were hoping for some kind of enforcement action because that would allow them to take their cause into court. So when police arrived, it certainly wasn't a surprise. They were very upfront about why they were there. They explained that the city had passed an ordinance that banned food sharing on city-owned properties, and they said that if they continued, they would be subject to arrest. They did, and they were arrested.
And so you talk more about the strategy about bringing this to court. Does the group think that they actually have a good chance if this goes to court?
Yeah, I think they do. There were two real areas that they were hoping to focus on in court. They wanted to essentially challenge that this was an unconstitutional ordinance. And they also wanted to challenge that this was something that was discriminatory towards a very specific population of people, in this case being the homeless. So they were waiting for it.
And they weren't actually taken off in handcuffs. What happens next?
So over the course of the next couple of weeks, they will all have a court date and they will have to show up. They'll have representation. Lawyers will ultimately try and get the charges dropped, but they will also be filing a lawsuit in order to say that this was an unconstitutional ordinance. And so that will be separate from the criminal charges that will be filed or not filed.
There were questions about, was it citations or arrests, or what is the difference?
So essentially in California, certain citations are deemed to be misdemeanor arrests, but these individuals were not actually taken away in handcuffs to jail. So it was a very formal but short arrest. So they are arrested, they are cited, and they're released all in the span of about 15 to 20 seconds.
Oh, so interesting.
Yeah.
And the day after the arrest, we actually spoke to one of the organizers of the event, Mark Lane. He's a homeless advocate who organized the event, and here's what he had to say about the ordinance.
Why is it sanitary for you to have a birthday party and feed in the park, but it's unsanitary for me to have a food share and feed in the park? It's ridiculous. On its face, it's ridiculous. It's them, scratching at whatever they can to back up their bad ordinance.
And El Cajon has gotten a lot of publicity for this story, especially because it coincided with the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, and many people felt like the arrest just completely counter what Dr. King stood for. So KPBS's Midday Edition spoke to the mayor of El Cajon, and he responded to the criticism. Here's what Mayor Bill Wells said to KPBS's Midday Edition. He said a lot of cities have ignored these kinds of issues because they didn't want bad publicity, but I feel our responsibility to the public is more important than worrying about publicity or worrying about the political ramifications. And while El Cajon has banned the practice, they're not the only place where people are experiencing pushback for feeding people who are homeless. Claire, recently you spoke to some church leaders who are experiencing some pressure to stop their programs which feed the homeless. Can you tell us, where is this happening and why?
Yeah, it seems like it's happening in several places, and churches were saying that there's been resistance to them feeding meals to homeless people for a long time, and then hepatitis A was kind of added new fuel to that, where there are increased concerns. There's one church in La Jolla, Mary Star of the Sea, that actually did cancel its dinners, and I spoke with the priest at that church, and he said that hepatitis A was part of the reason. He didn't want to be blamed for bringing hepatitis A into La Jolla. And I actually talked with Tricia Souza, who was the person who was organizing the meals at that church, and here's what she had to say.
But I will stand strong with what I believe, and I do believe that you have to help people. I don't believe that you're enabling people. They're all human beings. I don't believe that. I believe you're helping people. They need to eat. So, I mean, they say, well, don't feed people, don't give them money. So we're going to starve them out? And then what? Starve them out like they're not humans and make them go downtown? Well, how fair is that to saturate one part of the city with the same population? Yeah. It's not right.
And Claire and Lindsay, it sounds as if from that soundbite that there's this idea of undesirables, as if that's part of the pressure to stop these programs is actually being fueled by some people who feel that these homeless population, people who are homeless, are not desirable people, that they don't want them in their communities. But then they're saying the reason is actually because of hepatitis A. Are you getting that feedback from some of these advocates?
Yeah, I mean, Break the Ban, I think, has been very clear that they feel that this ordinance is not necessarily something designed to keep the community safe, but in fact designed to keep homeless people away from the community. They don't feel like it addresses the underlying root issues that lead to homelessness, but that it attempts to make homelessness something that the community doesn't have to experience rather than actually solving it.
Yeah, I mean, some of the churches said that, like I said, people have long resisted these meals because they feel like that maybe means that people are more likely to hang out in the areas that they're in. And so they've wanted churches to stop feeding them for a long time. And then hepatitis A kind of pushed that up into the forefront. But I mean, I think one of the things that came up in my story is that the churches actually say, this is part of our religion. Like, we are doing this, serving people is one of the things that we feel called to do. And so we really can't stop doing it.
I think you'll see that repeated in the lawsuit, too, that's going to be filed by Break the Ban. I think that you'll see religious rights brought up.
Because churches were involved in El Cajon, too, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think when we're having conversations about homelessness, these protesters don't necessarily think that this is happening in a silo. They're very concerned that other cities who are also grappling with homelessness are watching how this ordinance is being received in El Cajon and are concerned that it will then be applied in other areas. And so that's also part of the mechanism of how they're responding to this.
And you expect that Break the Ban has already said that they're going to take this to court, but in the meantime, do you think that there will be more of these feedings and more of these acts against this ban?
Yeah, absolutely. So the next one is going to be scheduled for January 27th. It's in the same park, and it's going to be hosted by another group called Food Not Bombs. They've actually partnered with Break the Ban in protesting this ordinance. And then Break the Ban is going to hold another food sharing event in front of City Council at El Cajon sometime in January.
Very interesting. We will be following this story very closely. Corporate prisons have long been controversial for profiting from putting people behind bars. The Obama administration, in fact, instructed the Department of Justice to phase out the use of private prisons. Attorney General Jeff Sessions has since rescinded that order. There are 4 privately owned immigration detention centers in California. The only one permitted to expand is right here in San Diego County. The Otay Mesa Detention Center directly contracts with ICE and is near capacity. Maya, can you share with us the expansion plan?
Yeah, so in 2018, the Otay Mesa Detention Center will be adding a little over 500 beds for U.S. Marshal detainees. And then they have the capacity to add nearly another 1,000 beds, which could be used for ICE or for the U.S. Marshals.
And what's the makeup of this population?
So the majority of detainees are asylum seekers, or they are people who don't have any criminal convictions necessarily, but they just have immigration-related offenses. So they're kind of nonviolent. There are some, like the U.S. Marshal detainees, and there are some high-level high-risk detainees who did commit violent crimes, but the vast majority are people who are just there for immigration-related issues.
And in your report, you talked about the non-criminal detainees. So how long are they being held there?
So there's a huge range. It can be anywhere from 2 weeks to years. It depends on whether they are able to get out on bond, and it also depends on their immigration proceeding. So sometimes the court cases can take a really long time, and if they aren't able to get out on bond for whatever reason, maybe they don't have family in the U.S. to go to or something like that, then they could be in there for a very long time.
And how did it go from San Diego County not having an immigrant detention center until the late 1990s to now being near capacity?
So a lot of that has to do with national immigration policy. You know, there was a huge surge in immigration enforcement over the past several decades, and that has resulted in an expansion all over the country of immigration detention. And so in San Diego County in particular, this company, the private prison company CoreCivic, was very astute, and in 1997 they leased land from the sheriff's office and built a facility there and started contracting with ICE to put immigration detainees there, which was very smart because we're right near the busiest border crossing in the Western Hemisphere. And then once that contract was up, they purchased the property that they're currently on now and built that facility.
I was curious from your story. I mean, is it that they knew that there was going to be this need, or did they just get lucky, or can you tell?
I mean, I think that they are very savvy businessmen, and I think you can see that kind of all over the country. They saw that there would be a need, and you know, contracting with private companies is always a more affordable way for governments to be able to do many things, and so they saw an opportunity and they kind of went after it, and so far it's been paying off, especially with this administration.
Any idea like what percentage of this detainee population are actually asylum seekers, and where are they coming from?
So ICE didn't give me an exact percentage in the facility because it's my understanding that it kind of always changes, but they said the vast majority are asylum seekers, and they are mostly coming from Central America. And then the others are kind of low-level detainees. At the Otay facility, at least, the vast majority are people who have not committed really violent or serious crimes.
And paint the picture a little bit about this facility. Although these are people deemed non-criminals or low-level criminals, this is a high-security prison from the images I saw in your report.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a detention facility. ICE will say, like, for example, the lower level, lower risk detainees, they have more recreational hours, and they are in these housing units where they don't have to spend all their time in their cells, and there's some open space. So, you know, they'll kind of say that they have a little more freedom than, you know, someone who's in like a federal prison and is stuck in a cell all the time. But, you know, at the end of the day, they still aren't able to just come and go as they please or communicate with people. They've still had their freedom, you know, can take it away.
And California lawmakers have taken some steps to stop the expansion of these private detention centers. Still, this one here in San Diego County, this Otay Detention Center, you report, is the only one in the state that can expand. How did that come to be?
Well, so it's actually started a few years ago when the sheriff decided not to renew its lease with this company, and they went and actually purchased property themselves and built their own facility and now directly contract with ICE as a result of that. The state bill intended to kind of halt the expansion was using its power over local agencies to say you cannot continue to expand or modify or renew these contracts. But now this facility does not have a contract with any local agency as an intermediary. So as long as it has the property, it can still expand, though it does have to go through more extensive public hearings.
What's the argument against it, against having these privately run facilities?
In California, I think that they think that people shouldn't be profiting over imprisoning people. And there was also a bill passed last year to stop local agencies and state agencies from using private prisons as well. I think states have different philosophies about those kinds of things. Some people think that if you're going to be imprisoning someone, it should be a state responsibility and primarily like a state and government responsibility.
Right.
So.
Right.
And in your report, you include a statement from the Otay Mesa Detention Center, which speaks to what it calls high-quality, humane conditions. yet there have been some complaints and even some lawsuits. Could you speak to those?
Yeah, there's been a lot of complaints for the Otay facility, which mirror the complaints from facilities all over the country. Specifically, there's been a lot of complaints about medical care. There were complaints about pregnant women being detained. And then the most recent class action lawsuit actually talks to forced labor, saying that the private prison company is kind of making detainees work while they're detained there.
Very interesting. I'm sure this will continue to be a controversial issue. Shifting gears now, for a second year in a row, Tijuana breaks a record for homicides. In 2017, 1,744 people were killed. That's nearly double the 2016 total, which was also a record-breaking year. At the same time, there is a continued push for tourism in Baja California. Sandra, you reported that the drug trade is fueling this violence, but what's happened in the recent years that has caused this record-breaking violence?
I think what's happened is that there's a new drug trafficking organization called the Cartel Nueva Generación Jalisco. It's CJNG, that has been sort of making a bid for many parts of Mexico, including Baja California, which, if you think about it, is one of the most lucrative corridors for crossing drugs to the U.S. But what's been happening sort of on a street level is that people are fighting over the neighborhood drug trade. So there's really two things at play here: the smuggling corridor and the neighborhood drug trade. The violence right now is over the neighborhood drug trade, is what, according to DEA.
And so is this new drug cartel, or this relatively new drug cartel, is its tactics different than cartels of the past that have been in the region?
I don't think terribly. I just think we're at a very different period than in 2008. 2008 was also a period of a lot of violence. Even though the numbers were lower, it was spookier. It was Sinaloa versus the Arellano Felix organization, and you had a lot of extortion and kidnapping going on with this. This is more neighborhoods, just one guy here, one guy there, and it just has kind of crept up on people. It has not felt in the same way like the security crisis of 2008.
And so what's the recommendation from the U.S. State Department, which, as you know, gives recommendations for travelers when it comes to Tijuana and Baja?
Well, that's interesting. Baja California is a level 2 alert, which is just basically use caution, use increased caution. France has that same alert. Spain has the same alert. Mexico-wide is level 2. Just be careful is basically. Though in the case of Mexico, they've gone region by region, and there's 5 states where the State Department has recommended no travel to at all. Baja California is not one of those.
Do you get asked a lot as a border reporter, should people from San Diego or tourists be going across the border to Tijuana?
Yeah, I do, and it's a hard question to answer because it's so relative. It's like, well, where are you going and what are you going to do? Are you going to go buy drugs there? Are you just going to go to a restaurant? I think you're pretty okay going to a restaurant or hotel or the Valle de Guadalupe for the weekend.
So the violence is pretty concentrated in certain neighborhoods and areas.
Yeah, it's generally targeted violence. Mm-hmm. So, and it's certain neighborhoods. Like you might not go to certain neighborhoods in U.S. cities. Well, these are neighborhoods where you might not go at night, especially if you don't belong there.
How do business owners feel about it? I mean, are business owners feeling the effects of the level 2 warning, or do they say that everything is running smoothly?
Well, you mean tourism promoters?
Yeah.
I think tourism has really changed. I think over the past 20 years that I've been covering this area, I think we used to think of tourism as the American family coming down for the day or Marines coming down. And tourism is also many things. There's conventions tourism, there's medical tourism, there's groups that go down, like Turista Libre brings down tourists. So I think we're really seeing a changed face of tourism. And I think tourism has, continued. It's always a struggle, and people are concerned about the state's image. Yes.
And opening it up to the entire group, since we are so close to Tijuana, proximity-wise, does anyone else, either for work or fun, venture to Tijuana? And if so, do you take any added precautions?
No, Maya has.
I mean, I feel like when I'm traveling in general, I'm just pretty cautious. Like, I don't tend to walk down abandoned streets at night and not wear really flashy stuff or anything like that. So in that sense, it's different. But I'm also fairly certain that most of the places I have been in Tijuana are probably some of the safer places. I've gone down quite a bit to cover like development issues in Tijuana, and so a lot of those places are like middle class areas where they're looking to invest, where a lot of people who are from Tijuana but were living in like Chula Vista, for example, are planning on coming back, or even San Diegans who want cheaper housing are going there. So I'm assuming those are neighborhoods that are less impacted by some of this.
Right. You're right.
I feel like people from outside San Diego, my parents were just here visiting, and they were saying, oh, I would never cross the border, I would never go there. But for people who live in San Diego, have more of a realistic view of
Though I'm still surprised by people who say, "Oh, I would never go there," and
well, they hear stories or
saddened.
headlines like your story of highest murder rate in years, and think.
Right, but I wish they'd read down a little bit in the story where, tourism continues. These are targeted killings in well-identified sections of the city. The chance if you're just going to go down for a nice meal or to a concert is very low.
Right.
Yeah, and I think to Claire's point, we have really seen we've seen a long history of violence in Mexico as people, at least for me, I've lived here for more than 10 years. And I do feel like this feels different than in 2008 when things were, a little bit creepier.
Well, it also, the economy was at a very different point. There was just recession. People were losing jobs. Where were these guys going to work? There was fear that a lot of young people would get recruited for drug trafficking groups. And I think now it's just a different time economically for the state and for the border.
And Sandra, while other people who are going to Tijuana may be able to stay within the tourist areas, I know that your report had some corresponding video, which was pretty gruesome, showing some of the crime scenes. So you don't have that same luxury as a journalist. You have to kind of get right in there. What is it like for you going into the neighborhoods where these crimes have happened? Are journalists well received, or what's the climate like?
Well, I think I was careful. There was only one where I felt a little nervous. What I found most effective was going there the day after, because when you go we'd go the day before, we'd go the day, not the day before, the day of, but we were with the Red Cross, right, with the Red Cross ambulance. So we weren't just wandering in on our own. I would not wander in on my own. We took measures to protect ourselves.
And what's the separation from the areas where tourists are typically drawn to and where these crimes are taking place?
A lot of the crimes are in these working class outlying areas. Tijuana is a huge sprawling city of 1.8 million people. I read an interview with a police chief who was saying a lot of the violence is taking place in eastern Tijuana, and that is true. A lot of there's certain identified neighborhoods. It doesn't mean it does not happen, but the tendencies are these sort of poor neighborhoods.
And can we talk for a moment about the victims of this violence? 1,700 people who were killed last year in Tijuana. The narrative often is, when you deal with cities that are high crime, coming from police, coming from the government, that the people who are victims in this case were also in some way involved in the crime aspect. Is that narrative accurate? Do you believe that narrative? What do the locals say?
Oh, it's a good question. I do think police have been saying for years, like 85 to 90% of the victims have criminal records themselves. They are part of this drug underworld. It's sort of a settling of scores. I think big picture, I believe it. I believe if you look case by case by case, you'll find it's that world, but maybe it's the guy's brother who happened to be standing there. I know there was a 12-year-old child at a market who was shot. So it's a world. It's a criminal underworld, and if you're near it, you are in danger, I think.
And what is the government doing to stop the bloodshed?
Oh, I think the government, has. I know the city is trying to hire more police officers. I think there's calls for the federal government to come back and be more involved because they have more resources. Now, I do also know that Mexico's Foreign Relations Ministry put out a statement basically saying, you know what, a lot of the violence has to do with drugs which are headed for the United States. You know, if Tijuana was not in this corridor that supplies drugs to the U.S., then maybe it would not be so violent. If all these weapons from the U.S. were not going to Mexico, then there might not be, so many killings. So I think we've gotten away from the narrative that this is a joint responsibility. There's been more finger pointing now. For many years, I think the U.S. and Mexico were working together, that crime is not, Mexico's problem. Crime is a joint problem.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. That wraps up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. Thank you to our guests, Lindsay Winkley of the San Diego Union Tribune, Claire Tragesser of KPBS News, Maya Srikrishnan of Voice of San Diego, and Sandra Dibble of the San Diego Union Tribune. A reminder to all, the stories that we discussed here today are available at kpbs.org, and I am Ebony Monet. Thanks for joining us at the Roundtable.